no question that this is a proxy war. Moscow has accused NATO and the United States of waging a proxy war, and that they are correct. The United States and NATO are supplying Ukraine with training and with equipment, diplomatic support, and intelligence support. There's no question that U.S. intelligence agencies are feeding Ukrainians directly real-time intelligence. I think that the distinction, though, is the United States and NATO will not send actual forces into Ukraine. That there have been some accusations of that. That's not true, and I don't think that will happen. I think the United States and NATO will continue doing what they're doing. It is true that they've been willing to take a bit more risk as time has gone on, as it became clear what the red lines were. So they've provided a wider variety of equipment. They've doing a lot of training back in Europe. UK, for example, has some 10,000 Ukrainians in basic training. So there's a little more risk there, but there is still that red line of not sending in troops to Ukraine. Well, in the beginning of the war, there were a lot of protests. Putin cracked down quite effectively so that the protests on the streets stopped. He also took control of the narrative through his dominance of the media in Russia and established this narrative about Russia fighting what was essentially a defensive kind of war against neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And that was quite successful. The problem he ran into was that his military forces were running out of personnel and were retreating, and he was facing defeat on the battlefield. He had to do something. Partial mobilization was the least bad of his options. So he has declared that. Of course, there's a lot of political pushback. He may be able to suppress that, as he did back in February and March. We'll see whether these protests expand or whether they peter out. But there's no question that there's a political price here. But I think it would be hard for Putin to end the war on anything, on any terms that the Ukrainians would accept. If Putin withdrew all of his forces, having spent all this blood and treasure, I don't see how he could stay in power. So he has climbed on the tiger, and now he's trying to ride it.
So how does this war ultimately end? How does, you have Putin who's unwilling to compromise. You have the Western support for Ukraine that seems like it's not going anywhere. Realistically, is this something that you see going on for years? Like, could this be, something like an Afghanistan for Vladimir Putin? Is that what you might be envisioning?
I can see three different endings to the war. One is the one that Putin is hoping for, and that is as Europe gets colder and energy prices rise in the winter, that European populations force their governments to go to Ukraine and demand an end to the fighting, maybe some sort of armistice along the current line. That'd probably be the best outcome for Putin. It's not impossible that Ukraine will, over the long term, be able to push Russia out of its territory. Russia might become exhausted. The history of these things is that most wars end when one side becomes exhausted after extended period of attrition. That could well be how this war ends. In that case, though, you're looking at months or years of conflict. One possibility is that the conflict might be episodic. That is, that it dies down at certain points. Maybe, there's negotiations at some point. That was the experience in the Chechen wars. The Russians lost badly in the first Chechen war. They rebuilt the military. They came back on the second Chechen war. It's not impossible that could happen here. There'd be some sort of pause with negotiations as both sides rebuilt their militaries and then went at it again. Well, I think the first U.S. goal is to maintain NATO and the stability in the East and to prevent a wider war. That's why NATO and the U.S. have not sent troops into Ukraine and have beefed up defenses in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Romania. I think after that, the U.S. is very invested in supporting Ukrainian independence and democracy, and is willing to spend a great deal of money, sending materiel and munitions to Ukraine to do that. I don't think the United States is trying to overthrow the Putin government. You don't hear any propaganda talk, aimed at the Russian people, trying to separate them from their government. But there's no question the United States is quite happy to have Russia weakened. Russia had been threatening, Eastern European countries, not just Ukraine, but the United States and NATO have been very worried about the Baltic countries. They're very exposed. Every day that the war goes on, Russia becomes a bit weaker, and the amount of time that will be needed to rebuild the Russian military gets longer. Even as it is, it will take years for the Russian military to get back to where it was. And of course, if the war goes on for many more months, that could stretch out to even a decade. So it's to the U.S. strategic advantage to have Russia weakened like this. That said, I think the United States would be perfectly happy to have a negotiated settlement if one could be done that was acceptable to the Ukrainians. Well, Russia is reaching out to potential suppliers, just as Ukraine has done. We've seen that the Iranians have provided drones. North Koreans are apparently providing artillery ammunition. India and China, being much larger countries, more powerful, offer the possibility of much greater support. But both those countries have been trying to thread the needle between supporting Russia, with which they have long relationships, and alienating Europe and the United States, with which they also have relationships. I mean, China, of course, we have a very competitive relationship, but the economic links are very strong. As a result, both those countries are willing to buy Russian energy at discounted prices, and they're probably supplying some low-level kinds of material. Early on, the Chinese, for example, supplied some food rations. You might see a few things like that, but nothing like major weapon systems such as U.S. and NATO are providing. And I think both those countries will continue, to pursue that policy. In other words, try to stay friendly with Russia, try to take advantage of the lower energy prices, but not do anything that would so alienate the United States, and particularly Europe, that it might endanger their future economic relations.